is that as a first rule of thumb, and this is where venture capital is very different from private equity, is that it's not really a portfolio at all. And you will have a successful venture capital fund if your best investment is worth more than your whole fund. If your best investment is worth less than the fund, it's unlikely that investments 2 through N will make up for it because the distribution is so extreme. And so given that we're trying to make money for our investors in our fund, we anchor it around, is this company going to possibly be a really incredibly successful company? And we have to, our mandate is we have to identify, there are maybe 3 to 5 companies a year in the US that are started in technology that will be billion-dollar plus companies, 3 to 5 in Silicon Valley per year that are going to be in that range. And all we have to do is get into one of those companies over the 2 to 3 years that we're actively investing each of our funds. And that's the mandate rather than the sort of portfolio approach. So I think that's sort of one of the other ways I've been thinking about it. It's really different from private equity.
I'm curious when you meet those people of enthusiasm, determination, up to stubbornness. Can you link that to their scientific or to their educational background, where they come from, which kind of faculty they are, from marketing, business, science, engineering, or is it equally spread?
There tends to be a reasonably substantive background of one sort or another, where so computer area has been very focused on computer science. I'd say business school tends to be quite unusual because it's sort of, again, the business school thing tends to be indeterministic, and that's sort of what people are taught in business school, is that you can't know anything about the future, and that it would be like a dog trying to understand Einstein's theory of relativity, and so you shouldn't try to do this. And so after you've been told this for many years, you tend to not do this. And probably that's also what marketing people would say. You can never know what's going to be fashionable. You just have to sort of figure out where the crowd is going to go and just catch the wave just in front of everybody else, or something like that. Whereas I think I would say the people who I think this has been the most the case have at least a very strong substantive background. In many, not all cases, they're quite good at articulating it, which is actually a fairly unusual combination. So you often have sort of classical engineer tends to be very introverted. In many cases, these are people who are good technical, scientific, engineering type people who happen to be rather eloquent at articulating it. Because one of the things that is very important in building these things is, they don't exist on day one. And so you have to actually motivate people, and you have to convince other people that this is a really important thing to work on. And I think this is one of the subtle things that's really valuable about the sort of the breakthrough technology, doing something unique, different that's not been done, is it is so much better at motivating people. And again, you can sort of debate how big this is, but one of my friends, Silicon Valley's Adam D'Angelo, started this company called Quora a few years ago, which is sort of a new search engine. And it's a hard, interesting problem, and there's a story around why this is a very important kind of a problem. Whereas if you're starting the nth social networking company, it's why should you work for this company rather than the next one, and why are you actually making a difference in the world? People are you want these things to be successful as businesses, but it's not the only thing that motivates people, and it's really worth thinking through, how these things do not motivationally work. And so there are all sorts of businesses that I think are possibly quite valuable, but end up being very uninspiring, and you end up with this very difficult problem of, if you're starting them, finding a very hard time attracting talented people. And conversely, if you have something where it's at least interesting, you at least have a chance of getting sort of a critical mass of very talented people. And this was very true of the genesis of the really great businesses. I think Google is still in some ways a very inspiring example, but the first 30 people at Google were unbelievably impressive, and then they somehow were able to maintain this, for the next 300, to some extent for the first 3,000 even. And I think it was in part because I think especially Larry Page was very good at just articulating this vision of how the most important problem in the world was organizing the world's information. There was much more information than people knew what to do with. And so Google was working on sort of creating this universal library that was the most important problem to solve, at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st centuries. And you may or may not agree with that, but that was a, good way, an important way to drive this.
Yeah, I remember there was a similar open question asked last Christmas by edge.org. It was, what do you believe is true but cannot prove to be true? And I think I remember correctly, it was Lee Smolin from the Perimeter Institute in California also. He thought anonymity sucks. And another question to you with regard also, obviously, to Facebook. Let's assume we live in a world where all data is readily unavailable. It's the first question. Would it be a good world? And the second question is, given the world we are living in, what kind of data would you believe should be more readily available to make this world a better place?
Yes. Okay, let's see. This is sort of a set of fairly broad questions about the question of privacy. I could probably spend an hour talking about just that question in particular, as I could about a number of these other topics, just to give a few highline thoughts. I think we're heading towards a much more transparent world, and I think there are ways in which that's possibly a very good thing, and there are ways in which that could be a very bad thing. I wouldn't be categorical about it at all, and I think it's actually very ambiguous how this increased transparency will work out. And I do not share the simple, naive techno-utopianism that it's automatically better, which was the 1990s version that have all this information and it will somehow have this effect of liberating people. You can also imagine authoritarian states using the information to arrest dissidents. You can imagine it sort of being you can imagine employers looking at pictures of their employees from years ago when they were in college and using that to discriminate against people decades after the fact in ways that end up leading towards a much more intolerant society. What I do think is true is that, like technology or globalization, the trend is towards greater transparency, and our challenge as a society is to make to have sort of it's not whether we can reverse that trend and just turn off all the computers. I think there's no good future where we just turn computers off. But it's whether so it's not a Luddite type thing, but whether we end up with a more tolerant world or not, and that's the kind of thing that I think we need to work on. I would say two other quick thoughts on it. I think one thing that was very positive about Facebook was it was fundamentally about real identity. So if you sort of say you had a lot of the 1990s versions of social networking where we'd have this thing and you got to be somewhat different on the internet. So you could be on the internet, you could pretend to be a dog, and somebody else could pretend to be a cat, and we'd let you interact like cats and dogs on the internet. And it turns out, no, actually most people just want to be somewhat like themselves. And so I think real identity was probably a key variable of Facebook's success. It was quite different from MySpace. Facebook started at Harvard. It was about college students trying to sort of represent themselves as Harvard students to other Harvard students on the site, versus MySpace, which started in Los Angeles, where everybody wanted to be a movie star, e.g. almost everybody wanted to be someone totally different from whom they were, and the branding was around pretending to be someone else. And I think one of the many things, but one very important thing that differentiated was this push towards real identity. And I think that's probably a very healthy development. Now, I think the one other caveat to this question of transparency is that there's obviously a question of what transparency means. So we have, all this data available, but what does it mean? How does it get interpreted? And this is quite difficult. And you could imagine there being all sorts of transparency where it involves, silly secrets or false secrets. So we make all sorts of things secret transparent, but we have to still ask the question whether the secrets are important and true, or are they just silly, which would be like, say, gossip websites about Hollywood, or are they, or politicians, or things like that, or are they not even true? And so, could we just have a file on the internet where we list all the witches in the world? And this would be great. We'd expose them all. But you have to still ask the question: do witches exist? And and of course, maybe witches exist, but maybe we're in a world where the witches are really disguised as witch hunters. So it could all be very complicated. And so I think you have to at least be aware that there may be many different levels to transparency, and it's not simply data that exists on its own. And probably the big challenge in the next decade or two will be to make sense of all this data, not simply having more data. We already have way more data than people can manage. And we're told that there are people who are witches, we're told the witch hunters are witches in disguise, we're told that no witches exist, and how does one sort all this through over and over again, I think is one of the really big challenges, and it's more of a semantic, more of a meaning question than a simple zeros and ones bits question.
Thank you, Peter Thiel, for a wonderfully inspiring talk and for a lively discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.